January 30th, 1945. Cabanatuan Prison Camp, Philippines. Sergeant Ihara Tsuneyoshi stood in his guard tower watching 513 skeletal prisoners shuffle between barracks, knowing his orders: if American forces approached, kill them all. Last month at Palawan, his countrymen had burned 139 prisoners alive. Tonight, gasoline cans sat ready. But at 7:40 p.m., something impossible shattered the darkness. Gunfire erupted from every direction, and American voices shouted in English 30 miles behind Japanese lines. How did American Rangers reach 30 miles behind enemy lines? The answer began with an act of horror that changed everything. December 14th, 1944. Palawan Prison Camp, 300 miles southwest of Manila. Japanese guards forced 139 American prisoners into covered air raid trenches, doused them with gasoline, and dropped lit torches inside. Men screamed as flames consumed them. Those who escaped the fire were machine-gunned or bayoneted. Only 11 prisoners survived by leaping off 40-foot cliffs into the sea and swimming through shark-infested waters to freedom. The Palawan massacre wasn't an isolated incident, it was policy. American intelligence soon discovered a captured Japanese military directive issued to all POW camp commanders: dispose of them as the situation dictates, annihilate them all, and not to leave any traces. 6 weeks later, that directive threatened 513 Allied prisoners at Cabanatuan Prison Camp in Nueva Ecija Province, Philippines. These men had survived 3 years of hell. They'd endured the Bataan Death March in April 1942, when Japanese guards forced 70,000 captured Allied troops to walk 65 miles in scorching heat with no food or water. 10,000 died in the first week. The survivors reached Cabanatuan and faced systematic starvation, 600 calories per day of rice gruel, contaminated water breeding dysentery and malaria, tropical ulcers that exposed bone, random beatings that left men crippled. Of the 70,000 captured at Bataan, only around 2,000 survived to January 1945. The men at Cabanatuan weighed between 90 and 110 pounds, skeletons wrapped in yellow skin. They were dying at a rate of 3 per day. On January 26, 1945, Major Robert Lapham, an American guerrilla coordinator operating behind Japanese lines, reached 6th Army headquarters with urgent intelligence. American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had landed at Lingayen Gulf on January 9th and were pushing south toward Manila. MacArthur's corps would reach Cabanatuan within 5 days. Lapham's network of Filipino informants confirmed Japanese commanders had received orders identical to Palawan: kill all prisoners before American liberation. The clock was ticking. Intelligence estimated the Japanese would execute the Cabanatuan prisoners within 48 to 72 hours. Lieutenant General Walter Krueger, commanding 6th Army, faced an impossible decision. Standard military doctrine prohibited deep raids behind enemy lines to rescue prisoners. Too risky, too many variables, too high a probability of complete mission failure, resulting in the deaths of both rescuers and prisoners. Krueger's intelligence officer, Colonel Horton White, confirmed the odds. 300 Japanese guards inside Cabanatuan camp, 1,000 troops with tanks positioned at the Cabu River bridge 3 miles northeast, and approximately 5,000 Japanese soldiers occupying Cabanatuan City 5 miles east. Any rescue force would be outnumbered at least 50 to 1, operating 30 miles behind enemy lines, with zero possibility of reinforcement or air support beyond a single diversionary aircraft. Failure meant not just losing the rescue force, but also guaranteeing the immediate execution of all 513 prisoners. Krueger gave the order anyway. On January 27th, he summoned Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, commander of the 6th Ranger Battalion, to headquarters. Mucci was 33 years old, a West Point graduate who'd spent the past 12 months in New Guinea transforming support troops and mule skinners into an elite ranger unit. His men had trained relentlessly: jungle survival, hand-to-hand combat, knife fighting, night operations, 30-mile forced marches carrying full combat loads. They were ready, but they'd never fired a shot in combat. Mucci selected 121 men from C Company and F Company. He assembled them at Guimba and delivered an oath no commander should ask and no soldier should have to swear. "I want you to swear an oath before God," Mucci said. "Swear that you'll die fighting rather than let any harm come to those prisoners." 121 Rangers swore the oath. Time 0.5s, they understood the math. Their only advantage was firepower. Each Ranger carried an M1 Garand rifle, semi-automatic, firing .30-06 Springfield rounds from an 8-round on-block clip, effective rate of fire 40 to 50 rounds per minute at ranges up to 500 yards. The Japanese defenders used Type 38 Arisaka bolt-action rifles, 6.5mm, 5-round internal magazine, 30 rounds per minute maximum, requiring manual bolt cycling between each shot. On paper, American semi-automatic fire gave them a 60% faster sustained rate. Rangers also carried Thompson submachine guns, firing .45 ACP rounds at 600 to 725 rounds per minute, M1 carbines for lighter firepower, .45 caliber pistols, fragmentation grenades, and bazookas for armored targets. Technology advantages meant nothing against 6,000 Japanese soldiers. Private First Class Alvy Robbins, one of the Rangers who took the oath, later recalled Mucci's leadership. "Mucci was so charismatic you couldn't believe it, Elihu. If you ever had to go to war, that's the kind of man you wanted to go with." Charisma wouldn't stop bullets. The Rangers knew they were probably going to die. But 513 men were waiting in Cabanatuan, and someone had to try. The mission launched on January 28th. Rangers marched out of Guimba knowing that within 48 hours, they would either be dead or they would have accomplished what military strategists considered impossible. The Rangers needed what seemed impossible: perfect intelligence on a fortified camp 30 miles behind enemy lines. They got it from 14 men who could see in the dark. January 28, 1945, dusk. 14 Alamo Scouts left Guimba 24 hours ahead of Mucci's main force. The Alamo Scouts were 6th Army's elite reconnaissance unit, men selected through the most grueling training program in the Pacific Theater. Candidates underwent 6 weeks of hell in New Guinea, navigation without maps or compasses, survival on insects and roots, moving silently through jungle for days without detection, infiltrating enemy positions to within touching distance of Japanese sentries. Only 325 men graduated from Alamo Scout training between 1943 and 1945. Failure rate exceeded 75%. These were men who could crawl 800 yards across open ground in daylight and remain invisible. The Scouts split into 2 teams. Their mission: spend 24 hours observing Cabanatuan camp, counting guards, mapping defenses, identifying weak points, and determining optimal attack routes. By January 29th at dawn, both teams had infiltrated within 800 yards of the camp perimeter. They crawled on their bellies through rice paddies and grass fields, using irrigation ditches for concealment, moving only when guards looked away. For the next 24 hours, they watched. What they saw almost caused Mucci to abort the entire mission. Cabanatuan prison camp sat in the middle of completely open terrain, 500 yards of flat rice paddies with zero cover between the tree line and camp fence. 3 guard towers, each 12 feet high with searchlights and machine guns, commanded overlapping fields of fire across the approach. 1 reinforced concrete pillbox covered the main gate. 73 Japanese guards actively patrolled the prisoner stockade. Another 150 soldiers rested in barracks 200 yards from the camp. 4 tanks sat parked near the headquarters building. Any force attempting to cross that 500-yard killing zone in daylight would be spotted instantly and massacred. The Scouts identified something worse. 3 miles northeast of the camp, across the Cabu River, the Japanese 359th Infantry Battalion had established defensive positions, approximately 1,000 troops with additional tanks and mechanized support. If those soldiers received word of an attack on Cabanatuan, they could reinforce the camp within 20 minutes. The math was brutal. 121 Rangers would need at least 30 minutes to liberate prisoners and begin evacuation. If the 359th Battalion crossed the Cabu River Bridge, the rescue force would be annihilated while still inside the camp. This is where the Filipino guerrillas transformed suicide into possibility. Captain Juan Pajota commanded approximately 280 guerrilla fighters operating in Nueva Ecija province. These men knew every trail, river crossing, and hiding spot within 50 miles of Cabanatuan. They'd been fighting Japanese occupation since 1942. More importantly, they had something American forces lacked: the trust of local civilians who could provide real-time intelligence on Japanese patrol movements. When Mucci's liaison officer explained the mission, Pahota immediately understood the critical problem: the 359th Battalion at Cabu River. Pahota volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission. He would position 200 of his fighters at the Cabu River bridge, with orders to hold it against 1,000 Japanese soldiers for as long as necessary to allow the Rangers to complete the rescue and begin extraction. The odds were 5-1 against Pahota's men. They had limited ammunition, a mix of captured Japanese weapons and old American rifles, and no heavy weapons capable of stopping tank. "We will hold the bridge," Pahota told the American officers. "Not one Japanese soldier will cross while my men live." Pahota's tactical plan revealed sophisticated military thinking. His fighters would dig defensive trenches with clear fields of fire covering the bridge approach. They'd create crossfire kill zones, channeling any Japanese advance into predetermined paths where concentrated fire would inflict maximum casualties. Filipino guerrillas had home field advantage. They'd been fighting and surviving in this terrain for 3 years against an enemy with superior numbers and equipment. But holding against a full battalion assault with tanks meant accepting catastrophic casualties. The third element of the plan solved the 500-yard problem. Captain Kenneth Schreiber, flying a P-61 Black Widow night fighter nicknamed Hard to Get, volunteered to provide distraction at the exact moment Rangers began their assault. The P-61 was the U.S. Army Air Force's only dedicated night fighter, a twin-engine aircraft capable of 428 miles per hour, armed with 420mm cannons and 4.50 caliber machine guns. Schreiber's plan was audacious. He would make low-altitude passes over Cabanatuan camp at precisely 7:40 p.m. on January 30th, flying at 30 feet above ground through dust and smoke, engines roaring, to mesmerize Japanese guards and draw their attention skyward while Rangers crossed the open ground. The timing had to be perfect. If the P-61 arrived too early, guards would go on alert and the element of surprise would be lost. Too late, and Rangers would be caught in the open and slaughtered. Schreiber would be flying without ground communication, relying solely on synchronized watches. He'd also be flying dangerously low in darkness over unfamiliar terrain. One miscalculation meant crashing into the ground or buildings. The P-61 crew, pilot, radar operator, and gunner would be risking their lives for a ground operation they wouldn't even witness the outcome of. 3 separate forces, Rangers, Filipino guerrillas, and Air Force, operating with zero electronic communication, would have to coordinate perfectly across multiple simultaneous actions. One element failing meant total mission collapse. If Pahota's line broke at Cabu River, 1,000 Japanese reinforcements would trap Rangers inside the camp. If the P-61 distraction failed, guards would detect the Rangers crossing open ground. If Alamo Scout intelligence was wrong about guard positions or prisoner locations, Rangers would be fighting blind. Mucci reviewed the plan on January 29th. Every military principle argued for aborting. The risks were too high. Success depended on too many variables beyond American control: Filipino guerrillas who weren't under U.S. command, an Air Force pilot flying a solo night mission, intelligence gathered by observation rather than captured documents, and 513 prisoners who were too weak to walk and might not even believe rescue was real when it arrived. But Palawan made retreat impossible. Those 139 men burned alive 6 weeks earlier had no one coming for them. The 513 prisoners at Cabanatuan, dying at 3 per day from starvation and disease, had less than 48 hours before Japanese commanders executed them to prevent MacArthur from liberating living witnesses to 3 years of atrocities. On January 29th at 5 p.m., Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci gave the order. The Rangers would march. Pahota's guerrillas would hold the bridge. Schreiber would fly. And 513 men who had survived the Bataan Death March and 3 years of hell would either walk free or die, knowing someone tried. The Rangers marched into darkness, knowing that every step toward Cabanatuan brought them closer to death or immortality. January 29th, 5 p.m. 121 Rangers departed Guimba, carrying everything they'd need to fight, outnumbered against a fortified enemy. Each man humped more than 50 pounds of equipment, M1 Garand rifle weighing 9.5 pounds, 192 rounds of .30-06 ammunition in, bandoliers, fragmentation grenades, first aid kit, canteen, rations, and personal gear. Some Rangers carried Thompson submachine guns, adding an extra 10.8 pounds. Bazooka teams hauled the launcher plus anti-tank rockets. In tropical heat exceeding 80 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity above 80%, that load turned the 30-mile march into an endurance test before they ever faced combat. Filipino guides led the column along narrow trails, invisible to outsiders. These paths wound through rice paddies, across streams, and between villages where Japanese patrols could appear without warning. The Rangers moved in tactical formation, scouts forward, main body in column, rear guard watching for pursuit. No talking. Equipment wrapped in cloth to prevent rattling. Hand signals only. One noise could alert Japanese forces and bring hundreds of enemy soldiers down on the column. The first crisis came within 2 hours. As the Rangers passed through a Filipino village, local dogs started barking. In the silence of rural Philippines at night, those barks carried for miles. Japanese patrols used dogs as early warning systems. The Rangers froze. One sustained bout of barking would compromise the entire mission. Filipino guides quickly moved through the village, using pre-arranged signals with civilians they'd worked with for months. Villagers quieted their dogs. The column moved on, but every man understood how fragile the mission was. Success or failure could hinge on a dog's bark. At midnight, the Rangers forded the Cabu River. The water ran chest-deep in places. Men held their rifles over their heads to keep weapons dry. The current tugged at their legs. These rivers hosted saltwater crocodiles that could reach 20 feet in length. Rangers crossed in silence, each man acutely aware that one stumble into deep water meant drowning under the weight of equipment or becoming prey. Behind them, the Cabu River marked the point of no return. Beyond this, they were fully committed to enemy territory with zero possibility of reinforcement. While Rangers marched through darkness, the men they were coming to save endured their final day as prisoners. January 30th dawned at Cabanatuan prison camp with the same horror that had defined 513 men's lives for 3 years. Réveillé at 5:30 a.m. Roll call in the yard, where guards counted skeletal figures and beat anyone who moved too slowly. Breakfast was rice gruel, 600 calories of contaminated water mixed with a handful of rice, sometimes with weevils providing the only protein. This was more food than the prisoners had received in 1943 and 1944, when rations dropped as low as 400 calories and men died at rates exceeding 10 per day. The prisoners at Cabanatuan in January 1945 represented the survivors of unimaginable horror. They'd endured the Bataan Death March in April 1942, a 65-mile forced march in 100-degree heat with no food or water, during which Japanese guards bayoneted anyone who fell. They'd survived 3 years at Cabanatuan, where tropical diseases killed more efficiently than bullets. Malaria, carried by mosquitoes breeding in standing water, infected more than 80% of prisoners. Dysentery from contaminated water caused uncontrollable diarrhea that led to fatal dehydration. Beriberi, caused by vitamin B1 deficiency, made men's legs swell until skin split. Tropical ulcers ate through flesh to expose bone. Medical care consisted of whatever the prisoners could improvise with zero supplies. The men weighed between 90 and 110 pounds. Before capture, they'd averaged 160 to 180 pounds. They'd lost more than a third of their body weight. Muscle had atrophied until arms looked like sticks. Ribs protruded through yellow skin. Eyes sunk deep into skulls. Many couldn't walk more than 100 yards without collapsing. The physical impossibility of evacuation was this: 513 dying men would need to travel 30 miles through hostile territory while Japanese forces hunted them. Most couldn't walk to the camp gate without help. But physical deterioration was matched by psychological destruction. 3 years of watching friends die, of random beatings, of starvation and disease, had broken something fundamental in these men. They expected to die. News of the Palawan massacre had reached camp through whispered rumors. Prisoners knew Japanese commanders had orders to execute them before American forces arrived. Some men made peace with death. They, shared final possessions, wrote farewell letters they'd never send, and prayed for quick execution rather than being burned alive. At noon on January 30th, Mucci's Rangers reached Platero, a small village 1 mile south of Cabanatuan camp. The Alamo Scouts provided their final intelligence update. The Scouts had observed for 36 hours straight. Guard count confirmed, 73 active patrols inside the prisoner stockade, 150 more in nearby barracks. Guard towers, 3 positions, 12 feet high, equipped with searchlights and Type 92 heavy machine guns capable of 450 rounds per minute. The pillbox at the main gate, reinforced concrete, clear fields of fire. 4 Type 95 Hago light tanks parked near headquarters, 12 tons 37mm main gun, capable of massacring infantry in the open. The news got worse. Japanese troop movements had increased. A convoy of trucks had passed on the main road just that morning, heading toward Cabanatuan City. If the attack triggered a general alarm, thousands of Japanese soldiers within a 5-mile radius could converge on the camp. The original plan to attack at 5:30 p.m. had to be scrapped. Too much daylight remained. Too much vehicle traffic on roads. Mucci made the hardest decision of the mission: delay the attack until 7:45 p.m. after full darkness. That meant the Rangers would spend nearly 5 hours lying motionless in grass and irrigation ditches 800 yards from the camp, in full view of guard towers, if anyone looked closely. At 3 p.m., Captain Robert Prince led his men into assault positions. They crawled on their bellies through rice paddies. The water and mud concealed them, but it also meant lying in filth for hours. Leeches attached to exposed skin. Mosquitoes swarmed. Men couldn't swat them away. Any movement might draw attention. They lay perfectly still, watching the camp through binoculars, seeing the prisoners they'd come to save shuffling between barracks. Filipino civilians became the Rangers' camouflage. Farmers continued working fields around the Rangers' positions. Women carried water. Children played. This normal activity convinced Japanese guards that nothing unusual was happening. But the risk was suicidal if one guard decided to investigate why that farmer was working the same patch of ground for 2 hours. He'd discover 121 armed Americans lying in wait. Every minute that passed increased the probability of discovery. At 6 p.m., 3 miles northeast, Captain Juan Pajota led 200 Filipino guerrillas into position at the Cabu River bridge. They dug shallow fighting positions in the darkness, creating overlapping fields of fire. Pajota placed his best riflemen where they could target Japanese officers. He positioned his limited anti-tank weapons where they'd have clear shots at any armor attempting to cross the bridge. His men carried enough ammunition for perhaps 20 minutes of sustained combat. Against 1,000 Japanese soldiers with 4 tanks, that meant Pajota's fighters would run dry long before the enemy was defeated. They'd have to hold through sheer determination and the advantage of defensive positions. At 7 p.m., Captain Kenneth Schreiber's P-61 Black Widow, hard to get, took off from its base. Schreiber flew alone toward Cabanatuan, navigating in darkness with only dim instrument lights and the moon for reference. He had one job: arrive at exactly 7:40 p.m. over the prison camp and create a distraction spectacular enough to mesmerize every guard. He'd have no communication with ground forces. He'd be flying at 30 feet above unfamiliar terrain in darkness. One error meant crashing. But without that distraction, Rangers would be slaughtered crossing 500 yards of open ground. At 7:30 p.m., Captain Prince whispered to his men, "Let's go get our boys." Rangers began crawling forward. They moved inches at a time. 500 yards separated them from the camp fence. At crawling speed, that distance would take 20 minutes of agonizing exposure. Every second, they expected searchlights to snap on, machine guns to open fire, and death to arrive in a storm of bullets. At 7:40 p.m., the roar of twin engines shattered the night. Schreiber's P-61 screamed over the camp at 30 feet altitude. Japanese guards stopped patrolling. They pointed upward. Some shouted warnings. The aircraft banked hard, came around for another pass, even lower this time, engines backfiring and smoking as if crippled. Guards watched, transfixed, waiting for the plane to crash. In that moment of distraction, 121 Rangers reached the camp perimeter. They cut through barbed wire. They moved into final assault positions. Every weapon aimed at a specific target: guard towers, pillbox, barracks. 3 years of prisoner suffering was about to end in 30 minutes of violence that would kill more than 500 Japanese soldiers and free 513 dying men. Captain Prince checked his watch, 7:44 p.m. He raised his hand, and then he gave the signal that would make the impossible real. At 7:45 p.m. on January 30th, 1945, Captain Robert Prince gave the signal. 121 Rangers opened fire on 3 simultaneous fronts, and hell descended on Cabanatuan prison camp. The first shots came from bazooka teams targeting the guard towers. 2 Rangers per tower sighted their M1A1 bazookas, portable 2.36-inch rocket launchers capable of penetrating armor at 300 yards. They fired. High-explosive anti-tank rounds streaked across the darkness. The first guard tower exploded in a flash of timber and steel. Japanese guards manning the Type 92 heavy machine gun died instantly. The second tower disintegrated 3 seconds later. The third tower's searchlight snapped on, sweeping across the killing ground. Then the structure erupted as a bazooka round punched through the platform. Within 90 seconds of the first shot, all 3 guard towers ceased to exist. Rangers breached the main gate using bolt cutters to slice through chain-link fence. The reinforced concrete pillbox covering the gate presented a harder target. Its firing slits were narrow, designed to protect defenders while allowing interlocking fire across the approach. A bazooka team maneuvered to the blind spot on the pillbox's flank, aimed through the firing slit, and fired. The rocket detonated inside the confined space. The explosion killed everyone inside and blew out the rear wall. M1 Garand rifles cracked in sustained semi-automatic fire. The distinctive ping of empty 8-round en-bloc clips ejecting rang across the camp as Rangers reloaded and kept firing. Japanese guards, armed with bolt-action Type 38 Arisaka rifles, couldn't match the rate of fire. Time 0.5s, American Rangers were putting 40 to 50 aimed rounds downrange per minute. Japanese defenders managed perhaps 30 rounds per minute while manually cycling bolts between shots. In a close-quarters firefight, that 60% firepower advantage meant Rangers could suppress and kill defenders before those defenders could return effective fire. Thompson submachine gun teams cleared the Japanese barracks buildings. The Thompson M1A1 fired .45 ECP rounds at 600 to 725 rounds per minute from 20 or 30-round magazines. Rangers kicked in doors and hosed rooms with automatic fire. Japanese soldiers sleeping or off-duty died before they could reach weapons. Some defenders fought back with bayonets and swords in close-quarters combat. Rangers used knives and rifle butts. The fighting was savage, room to room, no quarter given or expected. 3 miles northeast at the Cabu River bridge, Captain Juan Pajota's guerrillas opened fire at the exact moment Rangers assaulted the camp. The Japanese 359th Infantry Battalion, approximately 1,000 troops with 4 Type 95 Hago tanks, had heard the explosions and gunfire from Cabanatuan. Officers immediately ordered the battalion to cross the bridge and reinforce the camp. The lead tank rumbled onto the wooden bridge. Filipino guerrillas detonated mines placed hours earlier. The explosion shattered the tank's tracks and set the vehicle ablaze. The burning wreck blocked the bridge. Japanese infantry attempted to advance around the destroyed tank. Pajota's fighters, positioned in trenches with overlapping fields of fire, opened up with every weapon they had. Captured Japanese rifles, American M1 Garands, Thompson submachine guns, and improvised explosives poured fire into the Japanese advance. The first wave of attackers collapsed with dozens of casualties. Japanese commanders ordered another assault. More men died in the crossfire. The guerrillas were outnumbered 5 to 1, but defensive positions and home terrain advantage turned the bridge into a killing ground. Japanese forces brought up the remaining 3 tanks. Guerrillas engaged with bazookas and Molotov cocktails, gasoline-filled bottles with burning rags stuffed in the necks. Guerrilla fighters rushed forward under covering fire, hurled the improvised weapons at the tanks, and dove for cover. 1 tank caught fire. Its crew bailed out and were shot down. The other 2 tanks began shelling the guerrilla positions, firing 37mm rounds that ripped through earthworks and killed fighters. Pahota's men held. They couldn't stop the assault forever. Ammunition was running low, casualties mounting, but they didn't need to hold forever. They needed 30 minutes. Inside Cabanatuan camp, Rangers burst into the prisoner barracks shouting in English, "We're Yanks! We're here to get you out!" The reaction wasn't relief. It was terror. Prisoners cowered in corners, convinced this was a Japanese trick to justify mass execution. 3 years of captivity had destroyed their ability to hope. Some refused to leave their bunks, certain that stepping outside meant death. They thought it was a trick, Captain Prince later recalled. Some prisoners didn't believe we were there to rescue them. Rangers physically grabbed prisoners, dragged them toward the exits. That's when the full horror of the prisoners' condition became apparent. These men couldn't walk. They weighed 90 to 110 pounds. Muscle had atrophied to the point where legs couldn't support body weight. Men collapsed after 10 yards. Rangers improvised. They stripped off their own shirts to make improvised stretchers. They carried prisoners on their backs. Some rangers carried 2 prisoners at once. Skeletal men weighed so little that one ranger could manage 2. Japanese defenders who'd escaped the initial assault began counterattacking from rear positions near the camp headquarters. Rangers forming the perimeter around the prisoner barracks engaged them in running firefights. The Japanese fought with desperation, knowing defeat meant dishonor. Rangers fought with fury, knowing every second delayed meant prisoners remained in danger. M1 Garand fire cut down Japanese soldiers attempting banzai charges. Bazooka teams destroyed the 4 Type 95 Hago tanks before they could engage. The tank's thin armor, 6 to 12 millimeters on the hull, couldn't withstand bazooka rockets designed to penetrate heavier armor. The killing was methodical and total. Rangers had sworn an oath to die before allowing harm to come to the prisoners. That oath meant no Japanese defender could be allowed to survive and threaten the evacuation. The Rangers executed that mission with ruthless efficiency. Japanese casualties mounted, 50 dead, then 100, then 200. The defenders fought until killed. Few surrendered. By 8:10 p.m., organized Japanese resistance inside the camp had collapsed. 2 Rangers fell during the assault. They died fighting to protect prisoners they'd never met. 4 other Rangers took wounds, but continued fighting. The disparity in casualties, 2 American dead versus hundreds of Japanese killed, reflected both the element of surprise and the devastating effectiveness of coordinated assault with superior firepower. At 8:15 p.m., the last prisoner cleared the camp perimeter. Filipino civilians arrived with approximately 50 carabao carts, wooden wagons pulled by water buffalo. The wounded and those too weak to walk were loaded onto the carts. The convoy began moving southwest toward American lines. Captain Prince fired a flare, the signal for Pahota's guerrillas at the Cabu River bridge to disengage and withdraw. Pahota's fighters had held for 35 minutes against impossible odds. Their defensive line was crumbling. Ammunition had run out for many positions. 21 guerrillas had been wounded, none killed miraculously given the intensity of Japanese assault. But the bridge still hadn't been crossed. Japanese casualties numbered in the hundreds. Bodies carpeted the approaches. The 359th Infantry Battalion had been stopped cold by 200 Filipino fighters who refused to break. When the withdrawal flare burst overhead, Pahota's guerrillas pulled back in good order, carrying their wounded, leaving mines and booby traps to delay any pursuit. The Japanese 359th Battalion finally crossed the bridge 20 minutes later. By then the prisoners were gone, the Rangers were moving, and the opportunity to intercept had passed. The extraction became a running fight through darkness. Japanese patrols throughout the region converged on Cabanatuan, hunting for the rescue force. Rangers formed a protective perimeter around the carabao carts, which moved at an agonizing 2 to 3 miles per hour, the speed of walking water buffalo. Every few miles, Japanese patrols made contact. Rangers engaged and destroyed them, then kept moving. The night march turned into a 30-mile gauntlet with hundreds of Japanese soldiers seeking revenge. 2 prisoners died during the extraction, one from illness, one from heart failure, triggered by the shock of liberation. Their bodies were carried out. No man would be left behind. The Rangers had sworn that oath, and they kept it to the letter. At dawn on January 31st, the convoy had covered only 9 miles. They were still 21 miles from American lines, and daylight made them visible to Japanese aircraft and patrols. But the prisoners were beginning to believe. Some regained enough strength to walk with assistance. Others helped carry weaker comrades. Hope, suppressed for 3 years, began to return. That evening, the entire force crossed into American lines at Gimba. The mission was complete. 511 prisoners had been successfully rescued. 2 Rangers had died. 21 Filipino guerrillas had been wounded. Japanese casualties were estimated between 500 and 1,000 killed. General Douglas MacArthur issued his commendation. The raid was the most successful rescue operation in military history. 121 Rangers had marched 30 miles behind enemy lines, defeated a garrison backed by 6,000 Japanese troops, liberated 511 dying prisoners, and brought them home. The impossible had become real. The rescued prisoners began their journey home, but freedom came with a cost measured in lives, scars, and memories that would last 8 decades. When the convoy reached American lines at Guimba on the evening of January 31, 1945, medical personnel immediately triaged 511 liberated prisoners. What they found shocked even combat-hardened army doctors. The average prisoner weighed between 90 and 110 pounds, a 50 to 70 pound deficit from healthy weight. More than 80% tested positive for malaria. Dysentery had ravaged digestive systems to the point where many couldn't process solid food. Tropical ulcers had eaten through flesh to expose bone on legs and feet. Beriberi caused by severe vitamin B1 deficiency had created massive swelling in extremities. Some men had lost all their teeth to scurvy. Most required immediate hospitalization. Recovery would take months, and for some, the damage was irreversible. The final casualty count told the story of impossible odds overcome. 2 Rangers had been killed in action. Captain James Fisher died from mortar shrapnel wounds to his stomach, liver, and kidneys sustained during the assault. He'd insisted on joining the attack instead of waiting at the surgical aid station. Filipino doctors tried desperately to save him, and local civilians spent hours building an emergency airstrip with hand tools and bare hands, hoping to evacuate Fisher by aircraft. The plane never came. Fisher died after losing nearly all his blood. Corporal Roy Sweezy was killed by friendly fire. 2 rounds struck him in the back during the chaotic nighttime assault. Both men are buried at Manila National Cemetery. 2 prisoners died during the rescue. One suffered a fatal heart attack as a ranger carried him from the barracks toward the main gate. The ranger later said, "The excitement had been too much for him, I guess. It was really sad. He was only 100 feet from the freedom he had not known for nearly 3 years. Another prisoner died of illness after the convoy reached Talavera. His last words were, "Good luck on the way out." 4 Rangers sustained wounds, but survived. 2 Alamo Scouts were injured. 20 Filipino guerrillas from Captain Pajota's force took wounds during the brutal bridge defense at Cabu River. Miraculously, none were killed, despite holding against 5-1 odds for more than 30 minutes. Japanese casualties were catastrophic. Estimates ranged from 530 to over 1,000 killed. The count included 73 guards inside the camp, approximately 150 Japanese troops who had been staying at the camp that night, and hundreds killed by Pajota's guerrillas attempting to cross the Cabu River bridge. The kill ratio was approximately 250 to 1 in America's favor, a testament to the devastating effectiveness of surprise, coordination, superior firepower, and men fighting to keep a sacred oath. General Douglas MacArthur personally commended the raiders. He called the operation the most successful rescue operation in military history. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration in the U.S. Armed Forces. Captain Robert Prince also received the Distinguished Service Cross. Other officers received Silver Stars. American enlisted men and Filipino guerrilla officers received Bronze Stars. The recognition was appropriate, but for the Rangers, the real reward was simpler: 511 living men who'd been dead men walking 48 hours earlier. Captain Prince gave credit where it was due. Any success we had was due not only to our efforts, but to the Alamo Scouts and Air Force. The pilots, Captain Kenneth Schreiber and Lieutenant Bonnie Rux, of the plane that flew so low over the camp, were incredibly brave men. The mission had required perfect coordination between Rangers, Alamo Scouts, Filipino guerrillas, and the Air Force. One element failing would have meant total disaster. The rescued prisoners told their stories. They described the Bataan Death March, where 10,000 men died in the first week. They recounted 3 years of systematic starvation, disease, torture, and watching friends die at a rate of 3 per day. Their testimony sparked a new wave of American resolve for the war against Japan. The atrocities weren't rumors anymore, they were documented by living witnesses. The raid also prompted immediate action to liberate other POW camps. Within 30 days of Cabanatuan, Allied forces rescued more than 7,000 prisoners from 4 camps across the Philippines. The strategic impact extended beyond the immediate rescue to DK. Cabanatuan became the blueprint for POW rescue operations. Military academies studied the raid as a textbook example of special operations planning, detailed reconnaissance, alliance with local forces, coordination of multiple elements without electronic communication, and execution under impossible odds. The doctrine developed from Cabanatuan influenced rescue operations for decades, including modern hostage rescue missions by special operations forces. But recognition came slowly for the Filipino guerrillas, who made the mission possible. American media coverage in 1945 focused heavily on the Rangers, while underplaying Captain Juan Pajota's role. Without Pajota's 200 guerrillas holding the Cabu River Bridge, 1,000 Japanese soldiers with tanks would have annihilated the Rangers while they were still inside the camp evacuating prisoners. That suicide stand, outnumbered 5-1, outgunned, fighting with limited ammunition, was as heroic as anything the Rangers accomplished. It took decades for Pajota's contribution to receive proper recognition in American military history. The 6th Ranger Battalion continued fighting through the Philippines campaign. Sure, after World War II ended, the unit was deactivated. But its legacy lived on. The modern 75th Ranger Regiment traces its lineage directly to Mucci's unit. Every Ranger learns about Cabanatuan. The mission embodies the Ranger creed. Readily will I display the intestinal fortitude required to fight on to the Ranger objective and complete the mission, though I be the lone survivor. And most importantly, I will never leave a fallen comrade. The site of Cabanatuan prison camp is now preserved as a memorial in Nueva Ecija province, Philippines. A monument stands where prisoners once suffered. Annual commemorations bring together American veterans organizations, Filipino communities, and descendants of both rescuers and rescued. In February 2025, the 80th anniversary ceremony drew hundreds of people, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the 511 rescued prisoners. Those descendants exist because 121 Rangers, 14 Alamo Scouts, 280 Filipino guerrillas, and 2 Air Force pilots refused to accept that rescue was impossible. The mathematics said it couldn't be done, outnumbered 50-1, operating 30 miles behind enemy lines, evacuating 511 men who couldn't walk, escaping through territory, crawling with thousands of enemy troops hunting them. But mathematics didn't account for men who swore an oath before God to die before allowing harm to come to prisoners. Mathematics didn't factor in Filipino fighters willing to hold a bridge against suicidal odds to protect American Rangers they'd just met. Mathematics couldn't measure the value of perfect planning, elite reconnaissance, and 30 minutes of coordinated violence executed with surgical precision. The rescued prisoners went on to live full lives. They married, raised families, built careers, and grew old in the freedom that had been stolen from them for 3 years. Many lived into their 80s and 90s. The last survivors passed away in the 2010s and early 2020s. But they left behind thousands of descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren who exist solely because impossible became possible on January 30th, 1945. Hampton Side's book Ghost Soldiers, published in 2001, introduced the Cabanatuan story to a new generation. The 2005 film The Great Raid brought the mission to theaters. Both works honored the men who fought and the men who were saved. They also preserved the memory for future generations who won't have living witnesses to interview. On the 80th anniversary in January 2025, a ceremony at the Cabanatuan Memorial featured a young American Ranger from the 75th Regiment reading Mucci's original oath, "Swear that you'll die fighting rather than let any harm come to those prisoners." That oath, spoken 8 decades earlier by 121 men who'd never seen combat, had been kept. 511 prisoners walked free. 2 rangers gave their lives. 21 Filipino guerrillas bled defending a bridge. And the impossible mission that every military principal said would fail succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The final accounting was simple. Freedom's price: 2 American Rangers killed, 4 wounded, 2 Alamo Scouts injured, 21 Filipino guerrillas wounded, 2 prisoners who died during extraction, and 30 minutes of combat that killed more than 500 Japanese soldiers and liberated 511 dying men. The return on that investment: thousands of descendants alive today, a doctrine that saved thousands more prisoners in subsequent operations, and proof that when ordinary men commit to extraordinary sacrifice, mathematics surrenders to courage. The impossible had become real. And the men who made it happen, rangers, scouts, guerrillas, and pilots, had rewritten what military history said could be done.